Thank you, Dr. Ashu Sharma. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Uh, I will speak today about translating poetry, and I will begin with a poem. I'll share the screen so that you can read. Is it possible to share the screen, please? It has been disabled by the host. Hello.
Sir, it is enabled now. You can share.
Okay.
So seems like your voice is lost.
Wait, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it okay? I hope you can see the screen now.
Yeah. Perfect, sir.
Right. So here is a poem by the well-known Hindi poet Vishnu Khare. Before we begin to look at the challenges and dimensions of translating poetry, let's look at an example and see how translation begins to happen. So we'll see a few lines, consider the possibilities of translation of those, and then proceed to the issues pertaining to the translation. So जाने से पहले उसने कहा अपनी बेटी समझकर ही मुझे रख लीजिए वह सूखी सांवली लड़की जिसके पसीने में बहुत पैदल चलने कई बसें बदलने की बू थी जिसके बहुत पहने कपड़ों से धूपहीन खोली के सीले गूदड़ों और आम के पुराने अचार की गंध उठती थी उसे मैं वह नौकरी न दे सका बाद में मेरे वे नितांत अस्थाई अधिकार भी रहे नहीं The first two lines are जाने से पहले उसने कहा. Now, what are the possibilities of rendering the first and the second lines into English? Uh, Before she went, she said. Before leaving, she said. She said before she left. Before she went away, she said. Before going away, she said. You see, these options allow us to consider the emphasis. Now, if you ask, is there a universal answer? I would say no. The reason is we are dealing with language, and in language, that too, language in literature, there are no exact correspondences most of the time. Most of the time. Sometimes there might be. For me here, what is important is her departure and the words uttered just before the departure. So I would choose before she went away, she said. I'm using the pronoun she twice for the reason that for me, this she is the most important word, vah. Now, this vah does not exist in usne as such, right? But I can get my cue from the title. Going away because her leaving the place is much more important. So going can be used, but I would prefer going away. अपनी बेटी समझ कर ही मुझे रख लीजिए. Now, this is where you see a pre-existing translation intervenes. Indian English has been described as a language that is already a translation of English. So it is not British English as such, it is not American English as such, it is Indian English. And Indian English is already a translation. अपनी बेटी समझकर ही मुझे रख लीजिए. When somebody says this in Hindi, in English, it is like, suppose I am your daughter, treat me as your daughter. Imagine I am your daughter. What kind of phrase would you choose? अपनी बेटी समझकर ही मुझे रख लीजिए. Here, what we have to remember is what kind of person has said this. You see, Aristotle talks about the possible errors in composition. And one of those is when there is a confusion, he says the poet should visualize who is speaking to whom, in what circumstances, for what reason, for what purpose. So, the biggest temptation for the translator is to put his or her own discourse into translation. Here is a girl looking for work and she has not been given work, and her final plea is uh, consider me like your daughter and keep me. This keep me, you can say, does not fit into the translation because keeping has other connotations in English. But remember, the kind of job that is implicit here and the kind of speaker that is implicit here can use keep me. Employ me can be there. Give me the work, give me the job. You have to decide this. So let's say tentatively, I would say, before she went away, she said, treat me, treat me as your own daughter and keep me. वह सूखी सांवली लड़की. Now you see, the second problem is how do we choose to translate this सूखी सांवली? This is a problem of cultural translation. The earlier problem we considered was the problem of discourse. In a specific situation, how the words and phrases are to be selected, if necessary, altered and employed. Here it is Sukhi. Sukhi has so many meanings, you know. Obviously, it cannot be dry. It has to be thin. It cannot be slim. Just consider the word slim here. That thin, would you say dark, dark complexioned, darkish? Would you say not fair, not so fair? That thin, darkish or dark looking, because she is not black. So we cannot use black. Girl, young woman would not be suitable here. Because young woman has a certain connotation of political discourse sensitive to gender. That thin, darkish girl, जिसके पसीने में बहुत पैदल चलने कई बसें बदलने की बू थी. I want you to consider the word boo here. See, there are four kinds of, shall we say, odor, smell, stink, scent. Which word would we use? Because look at the range. It is the odor of old pickle, old mango pickle. It is of the damp old clothes. and it is of changing several buses, and it is of sweat. And actually, it is not of sweat, it is of walking a lot in sweat. See, there is a transfer from sweat to walking instead of the other way around. So the poet has reversed the direction of the object that smells. And then changing several buses itself does not produce any odor. But imagine how it is transferred into an odor or a smell, right? Now you see, the question in the translation of poetry centrally is, as far as I have felt it, of addressing the nature of poetic language. Poetic language, I am now reverting from the shared screen, I'll return to it later. One second. Yeah. So, you see, the poetic language is not the usual kind of language that we find in prose. One, poetic language is uh, largely what you call non-expository. There can be expository poetry also, but uh, distinctively poetic language is non-expository. It is compact and it is suggestive. So, what do we expect of the translator? The translator has to be a sensitive, cultivated reader of language and especially of poetic language. And the kind of reading that the uh, translator of poetry is supposed to perform is a stereophonic reading. I mean, the poet has to listen to two languages at the same time. The language that is the what you call the, I'll not say source language, I'll say the language of the preceding text or the existing text and the language of the succeeding text or the text to be created, right? So the language from which the translation is taking place and the language into which it is taking place. The poet as a reader has to listen to the two languages together. And really the beauty of this attempt of translation lies in the music that is generated between the two languages, where the two languages meet or where they differ, right? So, uh, three things then, just to go back. One, translation has to be sensitive to the cultural specificity of the text that is being translated, the discourse employed in that text. Three, it has to be sensitive to the literary artistic dimensions of the text, because a poem, like any good piece of prose like an essay or a story or a novel or a drama or an epic, is a work of art. And a work of art is a work into which a lot of effort has gone aesthetically and in the uh, and by way of construction of multi-layered meaning, right? So the difficulty now lies in rendering music. You know, several kinds of rhyme and rhythm in one language are untranslatable in another. But what does the poet then do? Sorry, what does the translator then do? The second best thing a translator can do is uh, try and catch the voice and the tone. The voice and the tone. You see, it has been said about the translations of Anna Akhmatova that the translators aimed not at the exact rendering of the Russian poems of Akhmatova, but the voice that was speaking those poems into their ears. So much so that sometimes they would skip phrases, sometimes add phrases to lend that typical kind of voice, a presence in their translation. If you find some of these things that I am mentioning a bit difficult to clearly comprehend, you will see once you begin to translate, if you have not done this before, these will materialize as actual problems, challenges, and accomplishments. Then the problems in translation arise essentially from the ability or inability to address the relationship between language and consciousness. What do you think of language? If we have thought a bit about language, we have studied about the nature of language, something theoretically, philosophically, the likelihood is that we shall have more answers available, right? For example, Bhartrihari understands consciousness as always, already. I'm using a Hegelian phrase, always, already linguistic. That there is no consciousness without language. So much so, he says that if a person has still not learned a language, his or her consciousness is also, in a way, proto-linguistic. Proto-linguistic. So there is some kind of structure already there which allows a person to be conscious, because it is by means of this vehicle of language or proto-language that you transact with objects of thought, of reflection, of perception in your cognition, right? So language is not to be treated, as I think most of us by now understand, language is not to be treated as something that exists on its own. That language is not a container in which meaning lies deposited. Language is a process in which meaning is happening always. So that Saussure has given us this lesson, right? Derrida has talked about it. And of course, I mentioned Bhartrihari in the Indian context. You see, Aristotle long back talked about potentiality. That uh, if a poem can be translated from one language into another, the potential of translation into the other language is already there in the first language, in the language of the poem in which it was written, right? So it is like what Benjamin was talking about in his The Task of the Translator, that the translator does not create something new. The translator is a person who actualizes an immanent potentiality already there in the so-called original. I'm saying so-called original because it is not original. Because language cannot be original in that radical sense in which something happens as an event producing something altogether new, right? Because if language were original, we would not be able to communicate and all, and we would not be able to translate at all. So what do we think of language determines what expectations we have of translation and what methods of translation we employ. So it's like people sometimes trying to find words in language B for words in language A, and doing sometimes some extremely funny things. This is textual fundamentalism and it serves no purpose. You see, languages have grown only by rubbing against each other and by borrowing from each other and giving to each other. Textual fundamentalism does not take us anywhere. And a translation is a force that actually fights against this tendency to textual fundamentalism, right? Because translation is a transaction between cultures and histories and times and languages and persons and readers and writers. And at a certain point, the translator has a very ambivalent entity. Is the translator or a reader or a writer? Is he both or is he neither? When you try to ponder these questions, you are unable to take a final call on what translation is and what the translator is, right? So it was an answer to this that led us to that formulation, which is now quite popular in translation studies. In place of saying the original text or the source text, we now use the expression preceding text and the succeeding text, right? So PT and ST, which means temporally the two texts are differentiated, but the privilege of originality is not given to any text. This saves you from that mistaken idea that the original is something that we have to try to reproduce in the translation. See, this is where, in fact, Walter Benjamin was, I think, the most radical thinker of translation. He said that in translation, the original is a point of takeoff. And if the translation in a servile way follows the source text, then it has failed. The translator has to take off. But he also says in the same essay that it is like uh, think of a vase, think of an urn, right? An urn that does not exist, but that exists potentially. So each translation contributes a fragment to that total urn or vase of the future. Hence, the poem, when it is written, or a text, when it is written, and I'm talking about literary texts, in a language, carries within itself the potential text that will be created by translation in future. This is what Benjamin was clearly indicating in that signal essay, right? Actually, the task of the translator is still the most thought-provoking essay to have ever been written by anybody anywhere. Well, I've said that translation is essentially a work of reading. See, if you cannot read, if you do not know how to read, forget about translation. The novelist Stephen King was asked by somebody, what do you think is required of a writer? He said the first thing is composition. If you cannot compose correctly, forget that you can be a writer. Then he says other things follow, like writing simply, writing cleanly, writing musically, writing effectively. Those are the things that follow. For the translator, the most important thing is the ability to read, and this is a competence that has to be cultivated continually. You see, translation requires actually triple activity at the same time. As you grow into translation, into the practice of translating, you realize that reading feeds into your writing, reading and writing feed into your translation, writing feeds into your reading, translation feeds into both, So it becomes a kind of triangle. Reading, writing, translating, all three are continually building the other two, right? Each is building the other two. And a circle moves both ways, left to right and right to left. Now, uh, in the tantric tradition in India, we have two very interesting uh, concepts, Bindu and Nad. Right? Rajshekhar refers to these in his, uh, what's the title of that uh, great work? Who's here? Anyway, Kava Mimamsa. Yeah, Kava Mimamsa. Bindu and Nad. Bindu refers to the visual dimension of the aesthetic experience. Nad refers to the dimension of the oral, the heard, the sound. Okay, so the visual and the oral, what you see and what you hear. The experience of literature is actually an experience of the visual and the oral together. Right? So the image, imagination, and the music. And of course, the music includes silence. Right? The translator has to pay attention to the two together. And when I said voice, voice refers to the presence of the singular person of the writer. And of course, when the translator translates text, then it becomes a new kind of persona. Personality undergoes a change. The voice gets now inflected with a second voice, the voice of the translator, who is trying to uh, speak in the ghostly voice of the writer of the text. Right? But that dimension of music is something that, if it is missing in a translation of poetry, even when it is free verse, makes you feel that something extremely vital is lacking. Actually, in prose writing, also, you see the aspect of rhythm in any good sentence determines how well we breathe. You know, a good text that has been recommended for the writer is try to speak or speak aloud what you have written. And if it does not interfere disturbingly with your breathing patterns, it is a good piece of writing to begin with. Now it can be improved. So if the reader feels that his breathing is being disturbed, the likelihood, according to that writer, is that the writer will dislike the reader will dislike the writing for some reason which she probably does not understand. Some of them might do, but most of them would say, well, I didn't enjoy this. So this kind of rush is, first of all, the rush at the level of comfort. So it is this comfort we are talking about, the comfort at the level of breathing. And this is where punctuation comes, right? Where the breaks come, where the caesura comes, where enjambment comes in poetry. Punctuation marks are the breathing stops, pauses in any, uh, you see, paragraph or any longer text or any sentence or any part of a sentence. And punctuation is something that remains marginalized in the consciousness of most of the readers and writers. You read a text, but you do not pay attention to the punctuation, because one reason is the way we are taught the study of language, especially English in India, is by focusing on the rules of putting words together and not on punctuation. Punctuation is supposed to be the minimal necessary evil that we have to live with. And you can see grown up scholars punctuating their writing poorly. Repunctuative writing and you'll be able to breathe intellectually your way into greater power as a thinker. Just try this and you will see how much change takes place. Now, Bindu can be visualized as what you call imaginary. Right? I'm using a term from Charles Taylor, the Canadian thinker. It is partly a Lacanian term, but also not entirely Lacanian. The poet Wallace Stevens is also being invoked here. That is, imagination has its own reality. So, what the poem produces for you and what makes it so powerful is one, the imaginary into which it takes you, two, the soundscape into which it takes you. So, if you can create something resembling these in your translation to whatever degree of possibility, largely determines the success of your translation in your own eyes. Right? See, you will never find everybody agreeing with your translation because, after all, translation is first of all an interpretation. But you will know whether you have succeeded or you have utterly failed or you are somewhere close to success. Right? So these are the tests. So I can say the voice and tone can be included with this, and the imaginary. Right? So Bindu and Naad. Naad and Bindu. Well, Benjamin uses an expression non-sensuous correspondence, talking about mimesis in the context of translation. Look how we connect ideas with ideas and understand things. This is the work actually of translation. Translation is not simply verbal, translation is also an intellectual exercise. Plato's idea of mimesis through Aristotle becomes at a certain point translation, right? Call it anukriti, call it anuvad. Translation is also an exercise in imitation, creating a copy, but a copy which is not an exact copy, but which is based on something but might diverge significantly from it, might diverge significantly. Several examples are there, from painting to architecture to sculpture to writing. Okay, think of the shield of Achilles in Homer. Think of the compassion or the pieta, the pity, Michelangelo's sculpture, in which a young mother is holding Christ removed from his cross. So the dead body of a young son of 32 in the lap of a young mother. And the mother looks hardly 30. And an answer to this that is given by art critics is Christ's mother is ageless. And Michelangelo did know this when he created that great sculpture. But what is even more intriguing is the expanse of the mother's lap. It is such a huge lap. It is the lap of the mother of the Son of God. So it is disproportionately huge. Now, it is this that I mean by copy, but not an exact replica. Translation is like this. The translator, as an artist, perceives something which is not to be rendered as it is. And in any case, what is the point of rendering something in another language exactly as it is? One, it is not possible. Two, even if it is possible, why do it? See, this is the distinction between a poor translator and a good translator. A poor translator thinks, well, this is a sentence, I'll render it like this. A good translator will probe the uh, possibilities latent in the sentence and then try to render those in his her reading and in the translation, right? So translation in that sense then becomes a creative act. Then look at sorry, go back to the idea of non-sensuous correspondence. Non-sensuous correspondence in the sense that, you see, when you are making a painting of an actual object, let us say you're painting a still life, it is a sensuous correspondence that determines the imitation. There are apples before you and you're making apples on the canvas. But in poetry, you cannot show apples, you can evoke apples through words, through images, through music. Benjamin referred to this radical limitation, but also radical possibility in translation. Why? Because this is the nature of language. Language does not correspond to things in terms of pictorial images. Language works by suggesting. And obviously, then this opens up the possibility of different people reading the same text differently, and then different translators rendering the same text differently in their translations. And then you have the third thing, the objective correlative of T.S. Eliot. Don't you think objective correlative is also a kind of translation? I would say it is a sensuous correspondence that determines the objective correlative. Things, objects are used to produce a certain complex of emotions, right? So what does the poet try to do? The poet tries to produce a kind of visual composite, to produce a non-visual experience. Is this not a translation? Right. Then this, I think, will automatically answer your question. How much freedom does the translator have? You see, the translator has freedom, but the translator does not have license. I'll give you a, a recent example from a translation in Punjabi of Kafka's Trial. Translating Kafka's Trial, the translator was unable to get under the skin of the writer. As far as we can, we should try to get into the skin of the writer. Now, one thing that has emerged in recent readings of the trial is that Kafka, having done a PhD in law, is intentionally using legal terminology in his text, which most translators earlier had simply overlooked. Then, what this translator did was he changed the gender of the cook. And because nowadays you say, मैंने घंटी बजाई, घंटी का मतलब होगा I gave a ring means that I called somebody on my mobile phone. Now, actually, in Kafka's case, it is pressing the button on the of the bell in your room so that the person in the kitchen or in the other room can come. So you're calling somebody. He says उसने phone दी घंटी घुमाई instead of saying he pressed the button of the bell. Now you see, this is the kind of mistake that happens when you don't try to get behind the appearances and you think that, well, translation is something that can simply be transferred from one language to another at the level of an idea. No, it is not that. Language and what is in language are inseparable. We do talk about ideas, concepts, and their expression, but actually, there are no ideas without their expression, and no concepts without their expression. And you know, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, those make a distinction between three things which became central to semiotics later in France. which is also there in like Buddhism. The three things are there is Shabd, there is Earth, and there is Pratyay. Pratyay in the sense of concept. So there is the word cow, there is the animal cow, and there is the concept cow. So when you are creating a character, how does the character conceptualize something? How does the character think a cow in his consciousness, in her consciousness? That will lend authenticity to the character created. Unless you try and reach that, as a reader, forget about attempting a good translation, right? So there are not actually good and bad translations. There are good and indifferent translations, I would say. Translations which pay attention to the text, translations which do not pay attention. Uh, how should a translator begin? I understand that there are young people participating in this workshop, and I am particularly addressing those. You see, a very good idea for a beginner in translation is to begin with fragments. Take, let's say, the statements, those wonderful epigrammatic statements made by Oscar Wilde. Okay. Then take short poems, take haiku, take an isolated sentence from a remarkable writer, might be from prose or from poetry. Render that in the language of translation. You will be able to focus microscopically, and you will not have the pressure to complete a longer passage. So begin with sentence long texts, then fragments, paragraphs, and an excellent exercise would be translate your own work. What you have written in one language, try to do it in another. And the moment you try to do that, you realize that another language has other possibilities. And then you realize that every language allows a certain kinds of sensibility to become operational, certain kinds of thinking to happen uh, more spontaneously or less spontaneously. And the benefit of practicing translation regularly is that you're able to dialectically move between two or more languages between which you are translating. Actually, Neruda's translations have been published in multiple translations. You see, his poetry has been published in multiple translations in the same volumes, so that you can read one poem originally in Spanish with two or three different translations at different times by different translators. And you can see how much difference it makes from translator to translator. Rilke has similarly been translated so many times. Flaubert's Madame Bovary has been translated so many times. Always compare different translations and don't try to compare the whole translation. Just pick up randomly a passage or select a kind of touchstone sentence or passage and then try to see the comparison. Like the opening sentence of the trial has been a test. So if you know that the two most important places in a sentence in prose are the ending of the sentence and the beginning of the sentence for the writer, you will know that Kafka ending the opening sentence with these particular two or three words has to be heeded so that in your translation you do not shift the focus. You see, it is something usually known to writers that the last place in a sentence is the most important and the first place is the second most important. So if you also learn how to write, you are able to learn how to read. And translation, being the translation of literature here, of poetry here, depends upon our ability to write well and to appreciate the act of writing. the act of composition, right? So as translators, we don't read like critics. As translators, we read like artists, as craftspeople, as writers. Okay, we return to Vishnu Khare, and there are about now 13 minutes left. Yeah, so I will share the screen again with you and take you to another poem of Vishnu Khare, which uh, I would like to share with you again. Uh, what is it? Can I do it? Oh, I think there's some problem. Hello, am I audible? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'll share the screen again. Yeah. So,
Yes, sir, you're very well audible. You're very well audible.
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Uh, yes. Here is a poem, Koshish. Mm, I'll enlarge it a bit, but not too much. Yes. This is a poem about birds, sparrows. In order to place the translation in its context, we have to know what the translation is about and what is the mood of the poem, right? So for that purpose, for translation, we'll come to the last part of the poem, but in order to get an idea of its emotional temper, we'll have to read the poem from the beginning. शाम को खुश लौटती हुई चिड़ियों से मैं पूछना चाहता हूं एक अशुभ सवाल कि आखिर वे मरने के लिए कहां जाती हैं, लेकिन वे मेरी तरफ उसी तरह देखती या न देखती हुई गुजर जाती हैं जिस तरह पार्क की ठंडी बेंच पर बैठे हुए खाली निगाह वाले बूढ़े के पास से स्कूल से लौटती हुई लड़कियां चली जाती हैं। चिड़ियों की मृत्यु मेरे लिए एक रहस्य है और यहां मेरा अर्थ पिंजरों में लटकाए गए पक्षियों की मौत से नहीं है जिनके पंजों से तीलियों को छुड़ाना कठिन हो जाता है और अचानक उड़ान में बिजली के तारों या मोटर के पहियों में फंस गए कौओं के शरीर से भी मैं उसे समझने की कोशिश नहीं करूंगा, क्योंकि आदमियों और आदमियों की चीजों के संपर्क से आई हुई चिड़ियों की मृत्यु मेरा विषय नहीं है। Right? In the first two stanzas, Khare is describing what he comprehends by death here, what kind of death of the sparrows he is denoting. Uh, in Avadhut Gita and in the Upanishads also, the death that has been wished for by the sage is the death which comes like the falling of a leaf from a tree. The leaf that has grown old on the tree breaks away effortlessly and glides down and dies. And the sage wishes that my death should be like this. So he's talking about that death of the birds which comes to them not in an accident in our civilization, but which happens naturally. Now we come to that stanza which I would wish you to translate, and which we will start today, and maybe this kind of translation can never be completed. नहीं मैं देखना चाहता हूं चिड़ियों को उस क्षण में जब वह आखिरी उड़ान के पहले अपना आप निश्चित करती हैं कि यह सॉरी, नहीं मैं देखना चाहता हूं चिड़िया को उस क्षण में जब वह आखिरी उड़ान के पहले अपने आप निश्चित करती है कि यह उसकी आखिरी उड़ान है। और बिल्कुल पहले ही की तरह उठ जाती है घड़ियों और नक्शों के बाहर, उस जगह के लिए जहां एक असंभव वृक्ष पर बैठकर चुप होते हुए उसे एक अदृश्य चिड़िया बन जाना है। देखना ही चाहता हूं, क्योंकि न मैं चिड़ियों का संकल्प पा सकता हूं और न उड़ान, मैं सिर्फ अपनी मृत्यु में उनकी कोशिश करना चाहता हूं। I find this an extremely complex idea. I'll tell you why. I hope most of you can already sense the difficulty in the reading of this poem. नहीं मैं देखना चाहता हूं. Did you notice that there is no comma after nothing? Usually we would put a comma there. But you can drop a comma when you do not want any pause. You want a continuity. So punctuation also exists as a set of rules to be violated in the interest of the text. Now we have to decide whether in English we can do this or not. And let me tell you, we can do this. नहीं मैं देखना चाहता हूं चिड़िया को उस क्षण में, उस क्षण में brings the first line of the stanza to an end. That is, if we are visualizing the movement of the words in the line, then the final focus before there is a shift to the next line is on the moment, on the instant. जब वह आखिरी उड़ान के पहले अपने आप निश्चित करती है कि यह उसकी आखिरी उड़ान है. The poet could have shifted from आखिरी to अंतिम. He does not. The translator has to catch this emphasis on the repetition of the word. See, there is an element of self-determination in the act of choosing death. It is like the bird decides, I am flying for the last time, and when the flight ends, I will die. Can we human beings also decide when we will die? You have stories of people who decided when to die and they died at that time. और बिल्कुल पहले ही की तरह, apparently there is no difference. As it used to take a flight, it has again taken off. But see, this is where the difficulty comes. How do you render it? If you cannot understand it, you see, as a reader, or if you cannot understand the difficulty of it as a reader, how can you render it in translation? So the precondition of translation is the reading. उठ जाती है घड़ियों और नक्शों के बाहर, उस जगह के लिए. बिल्कुल पहले ही की तरह उठ जाती है घड़ियों और नक्शों के बाहर, उस जगह के लिए जहां एक असंभव वृक्ष पर बैठकर चुप होते हुए उसे एक अदृश्य चिड़िया बन जाना है. उठ जाती है घड़ियों और नक्शों के बाहर. हाउ वुड यू रेंडर इट? आई डोंट नो. I have tried and I have tried, and there are, you see, tentative attempts. Like one tentative attempt would be trying to visualize this movement. The sparrow rises, it's like levitation, and she exceeds the time, she exceeds the clocks, she goes beyond clocks. She rises above and floats, drifts as if outside the clocks, beyond the clocks that keep time. Or naksho, naksho, is it features or is it maps? So anything that can be naksha, refers to space, spatial organization, ghadi, temporal organization, like always before. So there is no difference here. The sparrow exceeds time and space. This would be a conceptual rendering, but a bad translation. Can we retain the images and also translate this exceeding of her? उठ जाती है बाहर. See, it is not चली जाती है बाहर, उड़ जाती है बाहर. No, उठ जाती है बाहर. As if she goes into an ecstasy, rises out of her body, with her body, leaves the worlds of clocks and of maps, goes outside them, and goes for that place. उस जगह के लिए is not वहां चली जाती है. No, she proceeds towards that place where there is an impossible tree and where she will sit quietly and will become an invisible sparrow. An invisible sparrow on an impossible tree. Already, you see, time and space have been left behind. In another dimension of existence, which is impossible if considered from within the dimensions in which we normally exist within time and space. She has to go there. He says, I cannot actually think like a sparrow. I cannot cognize like a sparrow. देखना ही चाहता हूं. And see, here is the key to the nature of poetry. What you cannot think, you can possibly see. You know, Aristotle meant by theory thinking that is as clear as seeing. So to theorize is to think like seeing. देखना ही चाहता हूं, imagination that enables you to see without eyes. देखना ही चाहता हूं because this imagination will take you beyond conceptual meaning. I can always conceptualize the world of the sparrows, their inner world, but no, it is not possible. But yes, I can imagine it. देखना ही चाहता हूं क्योंकि ना मैं चिड़ियों का संकल्प पा सकता हूं. See how little a man is in front of an apparently small bird, which is not even a human being. The human being is unable to achieve pasakana, right? The ability to think that the sparrows have, the ability to imagine, the ability to project. Or na udan, nor can I have a flight. And this flight is not the physical flight only. Remember, it's a flight towards an asambhava vriksh and towards becoming an adrishya chidiya. मैं सिर्फ अपनी मृत्यु में उनकी कोशिश करना चाहता हूं. And here comes the most difficult thing in the poem. The poet could have said, मैं सिर्फ अपनी मृत्यु में उसकी तरह कोशिश करना चाहता हूं. It is not उसकी तरह कोशिश. It is उनकी कोशिश. In my death, I want to die as a man and become sparrows. And I want to attempt what sparrows attempt. Death for me should be an exceeding. Now you are able to connect, you see, and unless you are able to read the apparently harmless, simple, small words in their meanings, you are unable to make sense of the poem's gravity and how can then you translate. So when he says, उठ जाती है घड़ियों और नक्शों के बाहर, now you realize, उनकी कोशिश करना चाहता हूं. I also want to exceed my world of space and time as a human being and enter that world into which the birds will fly or they do fly when they die, when they're about to die. And I want to die, not like them, but I want to die their death. Right? So my point is, read as widely as possible and read intelligently and bravely, audaciously, connect, and try to find meaning. I hope whatever I said did make some sense. Thank you very much. I am stopping the sharing here. And my gratitude to every listener. Thank you so much. I hope I kept time. I have exceeded by 2 minutes. Sorry for that.
Not at all, sir. Not at all. Thank you very much indeed. You've very aptly highlighted the
Thank you.
basic triangular or cyclic association between reading, writing, and translating. Undoubtedly, without a complete mastery over both the facets of both the languages involved, a translator cannot do justice to the critical task of translation. The experience of visual image, imagination, and music is must for a writer as well as a translator. And the music doesn't only lie in words, rather, it is a literary paradox that understanding the silence of punctuations also contributes to the music of poetry equally. So, rather, in a very short span of time, you've provided an exceptionally wide coverage to the critical views of Slowacki, Benjamin, Franz Kafka, and Oscar Wilde, while providing an engrossing practical exercise on translating poetry simultaneously. There are certain queries which I would like you to address, sir. The first one,
Yeah, please.
which was often asked by the participants, is how far it is possible to retain the stylistic elements of the original text of the poetry while translating the translated version into the source language, into the targeted language. So,
Uh, you see, one, it depends upon the availability of the, rather the, you can say, if the succeeding text and the preceding text both belong to a same cultural formation, yes, then there might be a possibility of retaining some stylistic similarity. Otherwise, you see, what has happened is from critical practices, we have received some kind of like baggage. Because we read critically in terms of style, we think style can be treated as a separate issue. I would rather say that a literary text is to be treated organically, right? So style will emerge of its own. We don't have to like strive after it. So the most important thing for me is if the poem has a very strong voice of the poet, then the voice should be recreated as far as possible.
so keeping authorial
And
voice,
yes, the yeah,
yeah. So keeping authorial voice
author's voice, and you see,
and
yeah,
intention
author's voice, and you see, after all, when I say organic, I mean the what is the purpose of translation after all? The source text or the preceding text is being given a new home. If you are just planting it there without giving it a home, then what's the purpose of translation? So style is something subordinate, which will be natural.
which would eventually follow.
And then it depends on follow, but see, style is the most difficult thing to achieve for any artist. Style is, see, Proust said that style is your personal window on the world. How many people know how they see the world? And how do they express it? An artist is able to do that towards the end of his career. The translator should not be dreaming that high, I think, initially. That is something that will gradually come. And the translator has to have his own style in the translation.
So there is no fixing mechanism, you mean. In short, it is the organic whole
No,
which
no,
is
no, not at all.
there is no fixing
In
mechanism.
literature, certainly not.
Yeah.
Literature, certainly not.
Thank you. Thank you
Anything
very much,
else?
sir. Thank you very much, sir, for
Thank you. All the best.
investing your valuable time with us. Rather, your encyclopedic and awe-inspiring knowledge has enriched us immensely. Thank you. Your highly gratitude is to you.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful.